Tonight is week 3, lecture 6. Mainly, we are going to go over scenario design, not necessarily just like all the other lectures. We're not going to really do a deep dive into the technical aspects of building a scenario from the ground up, but I am going to give a brief overview of what a scenario is and how I want you to think of scenario design in the context of this course. And then we'll go over a few elements of that. And then I have 3 separate examples of scenarios I've built. One is for Littoral Commander, one is for, and the other 2 are actually for Command Modern Operations, but they all have different purposes behind them. So I'm going to kind of walk through, um, my thought process when it came to the scenario design, what the purpose of the scenario was for, or at least what I intended it to be for, and how I went about designing that scenario based off those. So, what is a scenario? So, to me, and the way that I want everyone to think about this is a scenario is just a story or a narrative used to illustrate a problem or situation. They can be based in real life, they could be hypothetical. It's really just kind of the narrative process that's used as a vehicle to be able to tell the players other kinds of information. And usually that's where you're going to find the information for, okay, where are the friendly forces? What's their position? What kind of condition are they in? Are they under fire? Are they healthy? Things of that nature. And it's also going to give the players information on the enemy. And a scenario is actually one of the key elements of having a professional war game. And just for everybody's reference, because I didn't go over them previously, I put those 7 elements on this slide. And so I'll upload the slides later after this class. But just so you're aware, usually a war game from the bottom up, you start with the aim and objectives. You figure out, okay, what is the purpose of this war game and what is going to be the purpose of the players? What do I want them to try to achieve? And then once you figure that out, you could call that whatever you want, whether it's learning outcomes, whatever term you coin for that, that's what you're going to build the scenario based off of, right? And so those are usually the first 2 steps in wargame design. And so scenario design just builds off of your aim and objectives. And so we'll go over that. So different elements that I believe are required at a minimum to comprise of a scenario is going to be the background story or setting. You need to give information to the players about why they are in the situation they're in and the surrounding environment. So if it's a Star Trek game, you might tell them about, different planet systems and, who's friendly to them, who's not. If it's a military focused game, you might tell that platoon, okay, this is where the enemy is suspected to be. You're on a patrol. You're just kind of painting a picture for the players to understand why they are in the situation that they're in. Following that are going to be objectives. So once you build that narrative or that background setting, you're then going to have objectives for the players. You're going to define what those are. And scenarios usually will outline those primary goals within the briefing or the background story or setting. Objectives, just like it says, they can vary widely. And objectives are kind of up to you to decide what they are, whether they make sense or not. It's up to you to decide based on what you want the players to be learning or what type of war game it is. So if it's a meeting engagement between 2 opposing military forces, they might be fighting over a town. And so I might make that town an objective, and then I might make some of the surrounding key terrain features, like, that there might be a hill that overlooks that town. That's a pretty good position. I might make that an objective to try to motivate the players without constraining their movement, but they'll just be organically motivated to go fight over those objectives because it's an objective. So when you're creating objectives, they can really be anything. So if it's not a military focused game, it might be, amass X amount of wealth or distribute X amount of resources. It really depends on the context of the war game, but the objectives aren't always going to be the same. Starting conditions, you need to have starting conditions in your scenario. it kind of plays back into that background story or setting. But the starting conditions are going to let the players know, okay, what can I do with my forces? Because they might already be planning, um, for something that they can do or something they might not be able to do. So you might have a starting condition in a scenario that makes everybody on the blue side have 50% ammo. That's something that you need to relay in the scenario briefing, essentially. That way they can make appropriate plans. And so the verbatim on the slide is just scenario defines the initial setup, starting conditions. The scenario defines the initial setup for each player, including the placement of units, available resources, and any special rules or restrictions that apply at the beginning of the game. So, kind of like that ammo restriction I mentioned. Starting conditions can significantly impact player strategies and tactics throughout the scenario. So that just goes back to the planning, right? They don't know what they don't know, essentially. So it's up to you to tell them. Victory conditions. These can be similar to objectives, meaning you can have victory conditions tied to objectives. So let's say you have multiple different objectives that you want a team to try to achieve, but it's unrealistic for them to achieve all of them. Well, you might say, okay, if you get 2 out of the 3 objectives, then that's a victory condition for blue or red, right? So victory conditions are the best way you could think about it is it's just a way for you to determine who wins. And that's also up to you depending on what type of war game it is. So if it's an educational war game, you might have very different victory conditions than an analytical one. Just because of in the sense that an analytical one isn't really about winning. It's about, kind of testing specifications and force design and things like that. But the verbatim on the slide is, in addition to objectives, scenarios specify the conditions under which a player can claim victory. Victory conditions might require achieving specific goals within a certain number of turns, inflicting a certain amount of damage on the enemy, or controlling key objectives at the end of the game. So for those of you who are familiar with Flashpoint Campaigns, which is a digital war game, at the end of most scenarios, there's varying degrees that a scenario can end. You can either attrit the enemy force between a certain percentage of combat power, which ends the scenario immediately, or you can actually do the objectives that are set out for you in the scenario. And so that is an example of 2 different victory conditions. You can do either A or either B, but either way you achieve victory. And then terrain features. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a requirement because based on the war game, you might not have terrain features be a key consideration. But if you are playing a game, think of things like Littoral Commander, which we kind of went through together. You saw how on the map you had a color grading system that let you know, okay, this is 1 movement point to go into a green hex or 2 to go into a yellow hex. That's a way to represent those terrain features. So, you have to use your imagination a bit, but it's a way to basically say, okay, this is relatively easy to traverse flat terrain. And then the surrounding area starts to get more hilly and more mountainous. And so if you have anything in your war game where those terrain features are going to affect a system like movement or line of sight, if that's in your game, that's something that you're going to want to explain to the player. And then on top of that, let's say this is a TDG scenario, right? Terrain features is simply giving them a visualization of the scenario. So that might just be a picture, that you did in Paint, or it might be a military style map with some icons on it. But either way, it's a way for you to basically paint those terrain features to the player. Are there any questions so far before I go into the examples? Okay. So this is an example of a custom Littoral Commander scenario that I made. And so it doesn't really have a name. The operating name is just Jagged Alliance, but the theme of it is I was really interested in looking at last year there was a lot of talk about China blockading Taiwan, and people thought they might invade, and Based off that, I was interested in saying, okay, if it didn't go kinetic, what would happen if the Chinese just blockaded Taiwan and they didn't fire anything? Would the U.S. respond? Would they be forced to? And so this was a scenario I made for that purpose. So it's an educational scenario, not necessarily to say, okay, yeah, if China blockaded Taiwan, that would be like the best case scenario for them, but more so to look at the students and their decision making process. And I'll go through how that kind of applies based on how I did the order of battles and blue reinforcements, and kind of there is a disadvantage here. So you can see in the top left, I put some, just very basic information about the scenario. So if this is a TDG, you might not have a turn limit or players, but you might specify where you got the map from in case they want to dive into it a little deeper. If you are doing a set of TDGs or some other kind of scenario, you might specify the level of difficulty. The level of difficulty here for this purpose was not meant to say, okay, you need to be a really good Littoral Commander player in order to beat anybody at this scenario. The level of difficulty here was meant to illustrate the complexity of the rule set, because I did add some custom rules on here to facilitate those learning outcomes that I wanted. And so if they weren't already familiar with Littoral Commander, it might be a little bit too complex for them to play out of the box. And so what you saw a week ago when we did the Vassal, that I also put in here, is the designer's note. And so this is kind of where I go through the purpose of the scenario for anybody that plays it for educational value. And I tell them some things up front. That way they don't say, oh, it's unbalanced, and don't really focus on what the scenario is designed for. So this is a way for you to explain to the players what they should be thinking about when they play, or to give them critical information like custom rule sets. And so you can see I told them it introduces 3 new mechanics: a blockade mechanic, amphibious assaults, and deployment zones. And then I also tell them that it's developed for professional military education purposes in mind. That way nobody thinks that it's supposed to be some like CSIS analytical next gen type scenario or something. It's just purely for fun. And then I also tell them at the end that the scenario should be viewed as a way to contextualize the discussion surrounding the Taiwan problem. And then at the very bottom, I also explain that the purpose of the scenario is to explore the advantages and disadvantages between a Chinese blockade of Taiwan or amphibious invasion with a delayed U.S. response. And so as I was designing the scenario, I decided that the learning outcomes would be, I wanted to create an interesting problem for blue and red both. I didn't want missiles to be flying right off the start. I wanted to keep it a little bit grounded in reality and replicate some type of high tension flashpoint situation where if China did put ships in position to blockade Taiwan permanently, I wanted to explore what if we already had things like expeditionary advanced base out there with the new Marine Corps force design. What would happen if they were isolated and they couldn't get resupplied? What would happen if, the population on Taiwan couldn't get food anymore? And so as I'm designing the scenario, that's what made me introduce the blockade mechanic, is because out of the box, Littoral Commander does not have any mechanic to really degrade ammunition supply merely by being encircled. And so I needed to create a system to kind of facilitate that tension where each turn that blue does not go kinetic against red and just lets them blockade Taiwan, they're going to be at a disadvantage further on if red does decide to invade as part of their victory conditions, because they won't be equipped to really fight off that beach invasion. So the considerations for blue in this scenario I wanted was, how long do you wait before you strike? And then because of that, I made sure that, and we'll go over this on the next slide, but in the order of battle, they don't get their entire force at the start. They start with that delayed response force with forces already encircled. And then to try to motivate them not to go kinetic on turn 1 anyways, the rest of the battle group ends up showing up later on. And then in order to balance that out with red, to make sure that red does not just fire at the very beginning, if they decide to go kinetic, they no longer get that benefit from the blockade mechanic. So if they fire on turn one, nothing on Taiwan loses any ammo or supply or health or anything like that. So it's a way to try to encourage red to plan an invasion or plan the blockade and then go kinetic. But I wanted both teams to kind of explore both options. And so this is the blue order of battle. So this is, it's super high production value, right? It's just pictures, copy and pasted with some text. This is a very simple way for you to have a order of battle that kind of visualizes things for the players. And so what you can see here is, like I referred to in the first slide, I also introduced deployment zones. And the reason I introduced deployment zones is because I wanted to give players freedom to be able to deploy, okay, where would my delayed response come from? Or where would my forces on Taiwan be distributed? That way it adds a little bit of replayability and you can kind of get some repetitions in to see, okay, what if I sent everything to the south of Taiwan and just turtled up, for example. And so this is how I kind of structured it for playtesting purposes. So this is a playtesting rule set from last year. And so you can see it's as simple as separating them into task forces for Littoral Commander, which were those 3 card trackers per that we went through last week. And I have more task forces than Littoral Commander allows for in turns. And so because it's a tabletop, I can just say, okay, instead of only going through 2 or 3 impulses per side, now we have 5. And then on the bottom right, you can see the naval deployment zones. I let them know what zone correlates to which hexes. And then I also give them a picture visualization later on. And down at the bottom here, this north zone, south zone, what I did for the land forces was instead of giving them very specific hexes they needed to be in, I just separated Task Force Houston and said, okay, you can deploy anywhere north of this line on the map with them, and you can deploy anywhere south with San Francisco. And again, it just gives the players a little bit more agency. The next step, because it is Littoral Commander, once I had the forces balanced out and I knew what kind of learning objectives I wanted, I then had to think about, okay, what kind of capabilities would I give these forces? Not just in terms of real life, but what would help balance it out a little bit in the scenario. Because you still want to make sure that each side has a chance to win, or else it's not really. It depends on what you're trying to achieve, but for the purposes of this, it wouldn't be educational to just say that red wins every time. And so for this, I just gave each side basically the tactical network that I referred to last week that kind of degrades the dice rolls. And then combat air patrols to abstract the aircraft that would be in the air. Once it does go kinetic, they would probably start going kinetic as well. And then because it's blue, and I wanted to kind of give some survivability to the forces at the very start to model that low signature footprint that the Marine Corps is experimenting with, I gave them a lot of naval deception and military deception joint capability cards, as well as electromagnetic jamming. And then I also gave them maritime strike tomahawks that I attached to the EABO to give them that first strike kinetic option or that self-defense option if they really wanted to also kind of explore, okay, what happens when an EABO that is isolated or an MLR that's on an island is isolated? What happens when they strike first? Do they just sit there and wait and do counter recon and recon, or do they actually get in the fight? So that's how I structured blue's capabilities. And then red, I didn't give them so much deception as I gave them things like social media, like OSINT type capability cards to try to model the demographic on Taiwan that is in support of the reunification. And then here I go over the blue objectives. And so the scenario was designed to look at, okay, is a blockade effective? Would it even matter? Would they just invade at the start? What would the player end up doing? In order to actually provoke red to invade at some point, I basically gave 3 separate victory points, which are singular hexes, but they're based either on cities on the map or infrastructure like ports and airports. And I made it very simple. Basically, all blue needs to do to win the scenario is delay red from taking 2 of those VPs that are marked on the map by turn 8. And the way that I kind of balanced the turns was I wanted to give enough time for red to effectively get in 3 turns or 4 turns of a blockade if that's what they wanted. And I also needed enough turns for blue to really be able to mount a defense once the reinforcements came in. And then at the bottom, you can see there's a separate victory condition that if blue does decide to get a little aggressive and maybe go for a counter punch instead of trying to defend, they win by destroying both of the Chinese LHDs. Because essentially at that point, they're never going to land on Taiwan and they're never going to get those victory points. So there are 2 ways for blue to win. They can either try to fight this delaying action across Taiwan and hold out for 8 turns, or they can go after red's carriers very aggressively once they actually detect them. And then another thing that I noted for clarification for the players was even if they did have ground forces on Taiwan, if their LHDs are destroyed, it's still game over for them. This is another slide. So kind of going back into the elements of Wargame, or sorry, elements of a scenario. These are going to be part of the conditions, essentially starting conditions, and a little bit of the background setting and story. And so these are the 3 separate mechanics that I made for Littoral Commander. The first one's the amphibious rule. So I needed to create a rule to allow red to land on Taiwan. And I tried to make it as simple as possible while also incurring some kind of cost to red. So not too complex that you didn't understand how to do it, but also simple enough to understand that it's going to cost you something in the game to achieve it. And it's as simple as, in order to load the ground forces that are on mainland China onto the LHDs, they need to spend 1 of those action points out of the 3 that you normally get, right? So it's a little bit of a trade-off. Red has to basically plan in advance when they're going to load up all of their ground troops. There's a considerable amount. There's about 2 or 3 separate ground task forces. So I actually think there's 3 now that I think about it. So in order to load up all of the ground forces, they essentially would need to skip an impulse. And so I tried to design the mechanic also around the learning outcomes, because I wanted red to be able to plan some type of invasion instead of just winging it and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then to achieve some type of realism as well, it takes a couple days at least to load troops and equipment up onto ships and then get them out to sea and ready. And so basically, I just add a slide here. So if you do create any special mechanics for a scenario that isn't part of the actual Wargame rule set, it's as simple as just creating an extra slide so the players know, okay, this is how I conduct an amphibious invasion. Or I don't want to look at all this other information. I just need a quick reference to my deployment zones for my reinforcements, right? And okay, it's right here. And then for red, I just remind them about the blockade rule here. And there are very specific blockade hexes. And so I'll dive into this mechanic before we kind of go on to the next example. Because this one was a very special mechanic to try to figure out how to balance. And essentially what I came up with was I didn't want red to be able to move their ships at the same time of being able to achieve a blockade. And I also didn't want them to be able to fire at blue and still get the blockade effect. So I already went over why I didn't want them to go kinetic. But basically, in order to prevent movement, I said, okay, you need to keep the ships that are already starting in these hexes in those hexes by the end of the turn, not the end of the impulse. So they essentially would need to stay there for, all 10, 11, 12 task forces. And if they do get shot at, they're kind of sitting ducks. So then it kind of goes into, okay, red, how do you layer your intercept defense to maintain the blockade and make sure that you have enough there? And so you just kind of go through that, you explain everything to the player, and then what I would do is instead of incorporating it into just the rule set, I would also just make them a reference guide for just the special rules and considerations. In case they already know the game pretty well, then they can just look at the new stuff that they need to be concerned with. And then it does go a little bit into more detail into what it does affect. So for each turn that the blockade is in effect, you subtract 2 from the ground attack, the long range strike, the supply, the intercept from all of blue forces on mainland Taiwan. And then red also gets an additional +2 to their influence meter. We didn't use the influence meter when we played, but the influence meter is kind of a way to abstract that non-kinetic effect and the social populace kind of having what's the word I'm looking for? Support. Yeah, support for what's going on. And then but because I didn't want red to be in a situation where they could just blockade for 2 turns and then blue can never catch up, for each turn that red blockades, blue actually gets 3 points to purchase new joint capability cards with. So there is a situation here where red has to determine, okay, I may really want to blockade for 4 turns, but I don't want to give blue 12 points to then buy like 5 or 6 kinetic joint capability cards to use against me. So there's a little bit of balancing that goes into creating mechanics. And this is just a more boring version of the previous slide. I've just written it out verbatim, just in case anybody needs a little additional clarification. So this is also going to be an example of an educational scenario, but this is more about ballistic missile defense. And so you can see the background setting and story is a little bit more, I would say, narrative focused than it is just designer notes. So this is Aegis Ashore. This is looking at ballistic missile defense in Japan if North Korea launched a nuclear strike or a ICBM strike against Japan. And so the way that I set this up is, if you're familiar with Command Modern Operations, you know how complex it is to operate and how difficult it can be to teach somebody new how to use it. If you're not familiar with it, you can think of it as just a really, really, really boring but interesting modeling and sim tool. It's just a commercial video game, essentially. But the design intent around this was I wanted to come up with tactical vignettes within Command that our students at Marine Corps University could play without needing to know how to operate the game. And so everything you see on the right is what's called a special action. So the scenario design intent was to look at ballistic missile defense. It was to teach students how hard it is to intercept ballistic missiles. It's to teach them the capabilities that North Korea has. It's to teach them the capabilities that we have. And it's not perfect. It's definitely not going to be one-to-one what happens in real life, but it's a way to kind of spur that educational value without them getting frustrated because they don't know how to operate the game. And so what you're seeing here with the special actions is these are all repeatable, or most of them are at least. You're basically a ballistic missile defense commander, and it's up to you to decide what kind of equipment and systems that you want to defend Japan. And then it's also up to you to basically go into the hot seat of a, Stratcom type person and then start deciding, okay, what am I going to launch against Japan? So instead of having an AI play against you, it's a way for you to experiment with different capabilities and kind of see where the gaps are and educate yourself a little bit better. And so you can see on the next slide, I'm just demonstrating. I clicked spawn 1 wave of missiles down here. It's letting me know that they spawned. And then it might be a little bit hard to see on the stream, I apologize, but these little red daggers that are heading towards Japan are actually ballistic missiles. And this is in God's eye view in the game, so you can actually see everything. But if you were on Japan, you might see some of these, you might see none of them, you might get unidentified radar signatures. It depends on what you put on Japan. And that's also part of the learning outcomes that I wanted to achieve, is to really just let people know how early of a warning that we actually get, and why that leads to a very dangerous kill chain. Here is going to be our last example of a scenario that I designed in Command. So this was actually done in Command Professional Edition. This is also done for educational purposes, but it was meant to be fun and competitive. So this was actually spurred from a research paper that I helped assist that looked at counter mining in a modern day Tarawa situation with unmanned, basically unmanned aerial vehicles and USVs in pairs. And it was to look at how many, basically how many pairs would it take to, get rid of X amount of mines or create X amount of lanes. And then what I did for this scenario to make it a little bit more educational and fun is I said, okay, instead of just detecting the mines for the mine ships later on, why don't we turn this into a bit of a force builder exercise where you basically have I created a list of platforms for the student, and they basically selected from that list based on, an amount of points that it costs to purchase that platform, and experimented around with, okay, what happens when you put Seafox killers on USVs? So not only are they able to detect the mines, they're able to get rid of them at the same time. And so it's meant to be educational, but it did have some analytical products come out of it through Monte Carlo iterations, because it really tried to look at, okay, how much time do we save by strapping basically mine killers onto these USVs? And how many USVs do we lose? The reason why I say it's more educational than it is analytical is because this was all uncontested. There was nothing firing at these drones. It was just purely for kind of an educational research question. And so I started basically designing it with just adding the mines, because that's what we were looking at, is mine detection. And then I decided the learning outcomes could be adapted a little bit further to say, okay, let's educate our systems on, or sorry, let's educate ourselves on the different possibilities that we could do, just because we have the tool available and it doesn't cost us any extra time. And then the second iteration that came out of that was, initially we didn't have any carriers. So once the drones were done, once the drones were out of fuel, that was kind of it. And then we said, okay, what if we actually gave them carriers? How long does it take them to return to the carrier and come back completely? So we looked at sortie generation for drones and kind of experimented around with that. And then this slide is just a visualization of, once they're actually on mission and getting rid of the mines. It's definitely hard to see, but this image right here is just showing that we had the Seafox killers added to the USVs and what type of USVs they were. And just, there's a 3D visualization right down there just to show how much is actually on the map at this time. So that's all the examples I have tonight. I hope it kind of gave you some ideas for how you might structure a scenario for a TDG and what kind of learning outcomes you want to look at. Scenarios in their simplest form are really just think of what type of problem you want to look at. And it doesn't need to just be military, but think of a problem that you want to explore or a question you have. What if, right? What if this happened? What if we did this? What if we added this weapon to this squad? Think of the problem, then think of a story that makes sense for why that problem is in the scenario. And you basically have 50% of a scenario. Then you just need to decide, okay, how do I structure the objectives, victory conditions, and kind of look at the forces to achieve the learning outcomes I want. So, if you want somebody to look at, let's say aerial refueling, maybe you're a logistics person and you're like, okay, I want my students, or I want my organization to really think about how many tankers do we need in the South China Sea to basically sustain operations there? And then you could take that a step further after you've built that scenario and add another variable and say, okay, now how many tankers do we lose if it's in a contested environment? And it's scenario design really is just kind of thinking of a problem and then thinking of how you can get your players to look at that problem. And sometimes you have to force them through objectives and game mechanics. Um, but sometimes you could kind of find that middle ground with the, for instance, this blockade rule is kind of an effective middle ground because I'm giving both sides an advantage to the blockade. Blue's getting something in return for what red's getting, but it's still up to them to choose whether or not they want to take advantage of this rule. So it's an example of how you can design a scenario that encourages the players to do something that you want, but they never feel like they're forced into that option. And once players feel like they're forced into an option in a scenario, then you kind of lose credibility at that point.